To answer the first part of the question, how has God opened my eyes to injustice in the world? I think that it's always kind of been there. I remember as a kid even feeling really burdened by, homeless people or, various other injustices that I saw even as a child. But then in high school, I remember the A21 campaign came and did a talk on human trafficking and particularly child sex slavery, and that was really confronting to me to hear. But I think as a teenager I kind of shoved it to the back of my brain and thought that's way too big of an issue for me to even consider or think about. It's just too hard and too heavy for me to manage right now. And then as a young adult, my cousin started eating only fair trade chocolate, and that was an awesome opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about this human slavery that's going on every day in these companies that we support constantly. And so I think that was a real eye-opener for me as well. And then over the last couple of years, as I've really grown in my faith, it's become much more of a wrestle with God, I think, to reconcile this just, kind, loving God with such intense injustice in the world. So it's been a real prayer wrestle, I think, and has involved a lot of Bible reading and talking to people, and I think just coming to the conclusion that, sin is horrible, but God is still a good God, and we are called to be his hands and feet. So, and then moving on to part 2 of the question, what have I done with that information? So I think that's an ongoing struggle in life, is how much is enough. I think I really struggled with that at the beginning because it felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't making a difference or it wasn't big enough. But watching my cousins have educated me, and then I started becoming more aware as a consumer, I saw that even just starting the conversation is actually really key. So for me in the beginning, it was about consciously trying to make better consumer decisions. So when I needed to purchase something, just having a think about, hey, is there a way I can do this without contributing to slave labour? And becoming more aware, particularly in the fast fashion industry, about how everyone needs clothes, but is there a way that we can maybe buy secondhand or buy ethically sourced? Just making these small consumer decisions that really do make a difference overall. And then another big one for me was in the human traffic industry. That's become something I've become a lot more passionate and educated about, and understanding the really close link that it has to porn, which I think is a topic that maybe could be seen as controversial or difficult for some people to talk about, because I think most people would have some story of how they have connected to that in some way. So to start having the conversation of what impact is this having, not just internally, because there are many factors like that, but actually by me consuming in this way, it's actually causing or being a part of a huge injustice issue behind the scenes. So to start maybe the conviction process of other people thinking a little bit more deeply about their choices is also really key, because it's unfortunately a society where it's accepted and not talked about. It's not talked about how it affects other people behind the scenes. So yeah, I think it's a real wrestle with God constantly, but we're called to be his hands and feet, so even little decisions and little choices and little conversations can be making these huge impacts in the end. So yeah.
G'day, my name's Jeremy. I've had the privilege of supporting Dave and Hannah over the last few years, and they asked me to do a video, so I thought I'd talk about the way in which I have been impacted by the injustice of other nations feeling the effects of COVID far worse than us recently. It led me to do something called the Ration Challenge, where I ate the same rations as a Syrian refugee, because there are people across the globe have felt the effects far worse than us and do not even have enough food because of COVID. I've got this statistic from World Vision. It reads 1 in 10 people around the world experience chronic hunger. So this is an injustice that I have been impacted by and wanted to do something about, and it led me to try and raise money for those people. But I actually want to speak about an even greater injustice that occurred, and a greater cause to get on board with, that's impacted me in an even greater way, and I'm going to read it to you now from Isaiah 53 verse 5. But he, talking about Jesus, was pierced for our transgressions and was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Now that's a crazy injustice, that he would die on my behalf for something that I don't deserve. It's a justice that had to happen, and it's something that has impacted my life because it's transformed me, that I am now saved.
As I grew up, I was pretty passionate about things like poverty overseas. At different points, did things like the 40-hour famine, trying to raise awareness and money for poverty overseas. As I grew up a bit more, I read things like Open Doors stories about persecuted Christians and being quite passionate about that. Did a couple of overseas short-term mission trips, and have always been quite inspired by things like Tim Costello's writings. He was the CEO for World Vision for a while, and have tried to, I guess, financially support in small ways friends overseas running children's homes and places like World Vision. But I think I've been fairly unclear on what my role is in overseas, and I'm still very much in a learning journey in terms of exploring things like fair trade, which I've learned a lot about through people in this church. I guess injustice that has been close to my heart, that I've actually put a lot of time and energy into trying to work out how to remedy, has definitely been to do with the abuse and neglect of children in Australia. I spent 5 years at university trying to work out what it looks like to look at the social work and psychology discipline, and then during that time I've become quite interested in residential care, which is our system for kids who can't fit into the foster care system. We don't have enough foster care carers, and especially the specialised foster care carers that we need for complex kids. And so I've put a fair bit of study and tried to work in that field as well. And I've worked in child protection in Victoria and New South Wales, and I think that's been really a big part of my journey of trying to tackle injustice in Australia, and quite struck by the differences in our culture that have led to a lot of those problems as well. Things like a lack of community to support people, who really have a lot of poverty of community, even though we're quite a wealthy country. I'm still very much on the journey of working out how do I even be part of addressing that. And I think God has just been showing me a lot of what it looks like to rely on his strength, I guess, in a very challenging work environment, to have courage and use him as an anchor point rather than real changing policies, I guess, and direction sometimes. But definitely more recently, just what it also looks like to release the desire to want to tackle it all on my own and take it all on my own shoulders, and to be able to release that to him and rest knowing he will guide me in what response that is to, and ultimately he is the one who carries all of that.
I had met Dave and Hannah in September 2019, and they shared a little bit about what they were doing and where they were headed, that they were working with the IJM. My husband and I had sent a small amount of financial support with them. We really felt on our hearts that we wanted to support them and also, support the survivors and work towards freeing those victims. And it really didn't feel like enough. It sat quite heavy on my heart for a couple of months, and it wasn't until the December of 2019 that I had received an adorable little Christmas card from our lovely friends Dave and Hannah. And this card, it's just a card, but it changed my life to turn it over and to read that it had actually been made by a survivor of the sex trafficking trade in the Philippines, and personally signed, and it was handmade. They're employed by a company called Good Paper. I decided that I wanted to share in this good news. I wanted to share the awareness about the human trafficking trade. So I started up a little business called Fair Tribe, and I managed to get an account and retail all these absolutely adorable cards that are all individually signed by survivors of the sex trafficking trade in the Philippines. And all the profits from my business goes back into purchasing more cards, which essentially employs the survivors from the sex trafficking trade in the Philippines. It's really opened up my eyes, especially for my children to learn, and for us to try, where possible, buy ethically made goods. It's not that hard to do, and the slavery trade is a real thing. It's happening around the world today, and it's had a flow-on effect with friends and family, which has been great. People have become more conscious about what they buy, or what they eat, or what they wear, or who made it, and were they paid a fair wage. And I'm just so glad that God had planted the seed in our heart. And